Guitar freaks, what's up? It's Pete Thorn. Welcome to the studio. Hey, this is a video all about my love of guitar amplifiers. First and foremost, I love guitar amps, you know that. But specifically in this video, it's kind of about vintage style guitar amps. Most of them, you know, in the old days had no master volume and not a ton of gain built into the front end of the amp. And if you wanted them to do their thing, and by their thing, I mean like get some really cool smoking guitar tones, you had to turn them up nice and loud and get those electrons flowing. And basically the tone was developed less maybe all in the preamp stage and more throughout the various stages of the amplifier, working in a symbiotic, really cool way to develop overdrive, distortion, compression, sag, and just an overall really cool dynamic guitar sound. A lot of younger guitar players will ask, what pedal do you use for your drive, or what pedal do you use for your distortion? And I always say, like, I don't know what to say to that, actually. This is my pedal for distortion. This is my pedal for distortion. This is my pedal for distortion. You know, the pedals for distortion are cool, overdrive pedals are cool, but there ain't nothing like a high voltage tube circuit, you know, getting pushed to its limits, and that's what's creating the distortion. I have this thing about guitar players through the 70s and then into the 80s and the 90s. I think that a lot of guitar players started using, as they came out and came available on the market, more sort of preamp gain based amplifiers because they were easier. They were easier on the ears. You could turn them down and still get a cool distorted or overdriven tone. And lots of famous guitar players started using them when maybe in the past they had used the more vintage style amps and had either, you know, hit them with a pedal or cranked them up loud just to get them to distort and get them to sound and feel good. Eddie Van Halen famously made this switch. He was using the 1959, spec 100-watt Marshall Super Lead for many years, and then late 80s, early 90s got a hold of a Soldano and fell in love with that, started using that, and then moved to his 5150 amplifiers, both from PV and then produced with the EVH brand through Fender. But other guitar players did this as well. Ritchie Blackmore moving to angle amplifiers at some point. Gary Moore is another famous one that made this jump to the Soldano amplifiers and, you know, got some terrific results and great tones out of those high gain Soldanos. But nonetheless, these are all guys that move from lower gain vintage style non-master volume amps to master volume higher gain affairs later on in their careers. They were not being driven as hard, so you didn't have amplifiers blowing up and failing as much. So there's a lot of pluses to those style of amplifiers, and they sound really cool too. And here I'm talking about, like, you know, amplifiers like Mesas and even the Marshall JCM 800, amplifiers like Soldanos, and then, you know, moving into the 90s and beyond, a whole bunch of amplifiers with the kind of cascaded preamp gain stages came out. And I love some of the guitar tones that happened, you know, into the late 80s, into the 90s, and, you know, in the 2000s and beyond. So I'm really fascinated by the subject. Like, what is it about some of the simple yet really dynamic and explosive sounding guitar rigs in the earlier days that sounded so cool and gave each player a signature dynamic tone? So here today I'll use some of my amplifiers that I've got here in the studio to try and demonstrate some of the characteristics of why I think that this is a thing. The number one thing I think about old 4-hole Marshalls, in particular Super Lead style, JMP style Marshalls, non-master volume Marshalls, the number one thing I think is that the tone is a sum of the parts of the amplifier all working kind of hard in tandem together, at least the way that rock and roll guitar players, you know, used to and sometimes still do run these amplifiers. It really is like kind of a synergy of all the different sections of the amplifiers working hard, overdriving, and kind of adding compression and sag to the circuit. And that synergy between all those sections of the amplifier working is what gives that kind of sometimes elusive, dynamic, and explosive, and really cool and unique sound. And once again, a sound that's really difficult, I think, to achieve in something like a 9 or even high voltage like 18-volt pedal, or even out of cascaded 12AX7 preamp tube gain stages. Number one, you've got the preamp of the amplifier. Okay, there's an input gain stage that is really just taking the low signal coming out of a guitar and amping that up to like something that the amplifier can work with. So there's not actually a lot of overdrive happening there in that particular stage of the amplifier. Where a lot of it happens, it seems to be, is in that second tube. So there's 3 tubes in these old Marshalls, okay? The first gain stage is just amping that guitar signal up, and then there's some overdrive happening in that second tube stage. But because the amplifier doesn't have a master volume, when you're turning up the volume control on the amplifier, you're driving that stage, but you're also driving what's coming further down the line, okay? So the next thing in line would be the phase inverter, which is actually part of, technically, sort of the power section of the amplifier. And that tube works differently than what's coming before it. Arguably, it's sort of, in some ways, as it's been described to me, I'm not an amp tech, but as it's been described to me, it's actually working sort of more almost like the power tubes of the amplifier as to kind of its overdrive and gain characteristics. So the phase inverter is that third tube in a Marshall Super Lead amplifier. And then from there, that's going to pass the signal on to the power amp of the amplifier. So how much of the tone is generated in the preamp and then generated in that phase inverter stage? Well, that's an interesting thing. I think a lot of the tone of what we think of kind of as that old Marshall sort of overdrive actually comes from that phase inverter stage, kind of getting nailed by that gained up second tube in the amplifier. And I can experiment with this actually pretty easily because I've got a Sur SL68 amplifier and it's got what's called a post-phase inverter master volume. So that means that I can turn down that master volume, and now I'm not driving the power amp very hard at all. And if I drive the input of the amplifier by turning up the volume on the front of the amplifier, now I'm driving that, like the gain stages of the amplifier in the preamp, into that phase inverter tube. And so we're only really hearing those two things distorting. And this is something that I'm going to demonstrate in just a minute here. But let's assume that I've got that post-phase inverter master volume on my amp on 10. And now I'm passing all the signal through to the power amp of the amplifier. Now what we're doing is we're also saturating the output transformer of the amplifier and getting some of the distortion characteristics of the output tubes, and just that entire output stage of the amplifier saturating and distorting and doing its thing. And a big part of the component of what's going on there to the tone is that we get a big old sag in the voltage of the output stage of the amplifier. So in an old Marshall amplifier, let's say there's 480 volts on the plates of the tubes, okay? You don't even need to know what this stuff means, but all you need to know is that if you're cranking the snot out of that amplifier and then you nail a chord hard with a guitar that's, got good output pickups in it, the power supply can actually sag as much as 50 volts. So you can actually measure that 480 volts dipping all the way down to 430 or 440. And then to a lesser extent, as all that voltage is sagging, what's also happening is the voltages in the rest of the amplifier are sagging, so even that are feeding the preamp stage. So the output transformer is saturating like crazy and saying, I'm full, I can't give any more, and the voltage sags, the power supply, sort of just all that happening creates this massive kind of compression, and then it takes a second for the amplifier to recover. That is a huge part of the tube, sound, feel, all that good stuff. Okay, so let's put all this stuff into action and listen. What I'm gonna do here first is I'm gonna play a couple of parts. I'm gonna use the old Van Halen part because I love old Van Halen. I'm going to play the part using this guitar into the SL68, and then I'm also going to play into my Germino, which is fairly heavily modded with a gain mod in the front. So it's got an extra tube in the front that's adding a gain boost. So it's more like, later stage, think of it as, into the 80s style amplifier, really, where it's generating a lot of the tone out of the front end of the amplifier, getting the tone out of the preamp. And I want you to listen to the sound difference, the dynamic difference between the two amplifiers, between the SL68 cranked way up and then between the Germino with its gain boost in front and not turned up maybe 75% of the way to where the SL68 is. So not driving as hard into the phase inverter section of the amplifier and into the output stage. Let's take a listen. And this isn't about which sound is even better or worse. It's just about the differences in the sounds because they're both pretty cool tones. Okay, one more time, let's go back and just listen to the leading edge of like the first two chords of that progression that I was playing on both amplifiers, on the modded Germino with all the gain in the front end, and then on the SL68 with kind of the gain spread out evenly throughout the whole amplifier. The difference is in the compression and the sag. On one, you hit the chord and it's linear. On the other one, you hit the chord and it kind of goes, ow. I don't know how else to describe it, but that's the magic secret sauce right there with the 4-hole Marshalls, and also with kind of like non-master volume amps in general. Really what it's about is less about the master volume and a little bit more about how much gain the amplifier has in kind of that first preamp stages of the amplifier, and then into the phase inverter, and then how hard you're driving the power section of the amp and how much there's this supply, like voltage sag, essentially, and the amp sags down because it can't deliver any more power, and then it kind of recovers. And what happens to your playing and the feel under your fingers when all that is going on. And I find this like fascinating. And once again, like one's not necessarily worse than the other, but I do think one has a more dynamic quality to it. And this is something we can even see by looking at the waveforms in the DAW. I took a picture of it here so you can check it out. Look at the more preamp gain based sound and how it's got kind of just a more linear look to the audio file, and then look at the SL68 and how it's got more peaks and valleys in it, and just it's jumping around a little bit more, and there's actually more dynamic in the sound. Okay, check this out. This is really cool. I'm going to turn off the speakers in the room and play through the amp once again. And so the only thing you're going to hear is the transformer buzzing away here in the room because the cabinet's isolated out in another room, right? You can clearly hear the transformer completely collapse under the weight of trying to deliver the power necessary and unable to do so. And then as kind of power comes back online, as it swells back up again, this totally corresponds to what I hear as far as that vowel-like sound and that unique compression that happens when you crank up these old amps, how it just sags and then sort of comes back up again, and how it makes like chords and single notes kind of evolve and sound really cool. The other thing I want you to watch for is the pilot light on the front of the amp dimming. That's another thing that happens, and especially on Variact old Marshalls where you're bringing the voltage down to like 90 volts. You know, you're starving the power supply even a little bit more. And yeah, another thing that happens is the pilot light just starts dimming, because once again, it's just another indication that the amp kind of can't make full power under the weight of what you're trying to get it to do. And it's just kind of a cool thing. Check this out. Okay, so what I want to do now is actually play through my Soldano on the lead channel. I've got the gain on about 5.5 or 6, you know, about just a little bit past noon. And I'm going to play the same riff through that amplifier and record it really quick. But I'm going to record it into my TC Ditto looper because I then want to play it back one more time with the speakers in here muted. And I want to show you guys what the amp sounds like. You know how I was showing you the buzzing of the transformer and all that? I want to show you what it sounds like when it's doing its thing. Okay, so that was interesting. Now I want to actually turn down the SL68 via the post-phase inverter master volume on the back so that we can gauge how much the stuff that's coming after the phase inverter, how much that's affecting the tone. Things like, you know, saturating the output transformer, driving the output tubes harder, and all that stuff. And we'll see how much the tone changes. And I'll play some low muted notes just to like, because that really accentuates how tight the amplifier is, and I feel like, and how much it's sagging. Okay, so I think that's pretty cool. In that test, you can hear what happens when we chill out the power section a little bit by not nailing it so hard. And so then we're mainly just getting the distortion out of the preamp and out of the phase inverter, which still sounds really great. It tightens up the tone a little bit, and actually for some things you might prefer it. But for some things, it's really cool to have the post-phase inverter master on 10 out of the circuit, essentially, and just be nailing that output stage and getting all that sag and compression. It's a little bit out of control, but, you know, if you're a good player and you can, you know, you got it in your hands and the volume control on the guitar, you've got all these dynamics there. One thing that's kind of impossible to test with the SL68, though, because it's got a post-phase inverter master, is what the distortion sounds like just in the preamp. Okay, so if we were to take the phase inverter out of the equation, what's happening in the preamp of the amplifier and how much distortion is actually being generated there? That's something I can actually show you on my Germino amp because it has a pre-phase inverter master volume. So when you turn it down, you're now not driving into the phase inverter so hard, but you can drive up the volume 1 of the amplifier and essentially get just the preamp gain that's happening in the amp. So let's check that out. I'm going to take out the gain boost in the front end of the amp, and I'll just have essentially plexi preamp, and we're going to listen to that, reduce the master, and listen to how much it cleans up and what the tone sounds like versus raising up that master and driving into the phase inverter harder and driving the power amp of the amp a little bit harder. Okay, here we go. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. You can hear right away the huge amount of distortion that's actually happening in the later stages of the amplifier if I've got the front end gain boost turned off. So in other words, that sort of the second tube, it's not really like making that much overdrive. It's contributing for sure, but I mean a huge amount of drive is happening in the phase inverter and then later on down the road in the amplifier. And once again, if I'll just hit record here. If I turn on the gain boost in the amp and switch in that extra tube in front of everything, now you're really hearing that cascaded preamp stage. I mean, that first tube stage contributes so much gain in you know, a Jose Mod style amp. And so many amps are kind of based around a similar sort of design where you're adding a gain stage in front of the good old Marshall plexi circuit. It's just a different sound. It's a more sort of even distortion sound, a more sort of predictable distortion sound, a little less dynamic, I would say, a little less wild sounding, a little less fuzzy, and maybe a little tighter sounding, you know, and it does do a great sort of simulation of that cranked Marshall plexi sound, the Jose Mod style thing, but it's not the same sound. And probably never will be. It's an equally as valid sound. I'm going in circles here, but I find this stuff really interesting. Hey guitar nerds, thanks for listening to me rant and rave about why I think good old school tube amp distortion might just be the best kind of distortion. It's really dynamic, it really responds to your technique, it really responds to different types of guitar pickups and pickup and volume control settings on your guitars. We didn't even get into how it can really respond to different effects, like if you hit it with boosts or fuzzes or univibes or like an echoplex, how much it can kind of, you know, be so dynamic and change with the sound that you're kind of hitting it with and all that kind of crap. Anyway, I just love amps. Once again, I love new amps too. I like the cascaded preamp amps too. It's just a different sound, but I do think there's something really special about the good old school amps where it's a synergy, it's a sum of the parts all the way down the chain in the circuit, and that's what really makes and develops the sound. And there's kind of only one way to get there, and that's turn it up. Please hit subscribe if you haven't, and hit the little bell beside the subscribe. Come back and see me for more videos real soon. I am Pete Thorn. Take care. Over and out.